Class, this is a supplemental review video that reviews and summarizes the muscles and the movements of the upper extremity. So at this point in the class, we've covered all of the muscles that move the scapula, all of the muscles that move all of the joints of the upper extremity. So we're just going to review those. Before we get into that, one of the things I want to share is as you're learning muscles, you can always be learning them muscle by muscle. So for instance, trapezius, learn the attachments, learn the actions. Deltoid, learn the attachments, learn the actions, etc. But what I'm going to do in this video is go through all of the actions, all of the movements that we have talked about, and talk about all of the muscles that do those. So by grouping the muscles like that, we instantly are getting groups of synergists. So all of the muscles that share the same action are at the same joint are going to be synergists. We also get antagonists. So if we're talking about shoulder flexion, and we have a group of muscles that do shoulder flexion, and we're talking about shoulder extension and a group of muscles that do shoulder extension, those two groups of muscles are going to be antagonistic to each other in that action of shoulder flexion and shoulder extension, or in those actions, I should say. So the other thing we get is, so if remember, whenever we're learning actions that a muscle can do, if a muscle does, for instance, shoulder flexion, we're going to stretch that muscle by doing the opposite action. So by doing shoulder extension, we can stretch that muscle. So so that's something else that we can get out of that kind of that pairing of antagonistic groups. So if one muscle does shoulder flexion and another muscle does shoulder extension, well, when that muscle that's doing shoulder extension is working, then the muscle that does shoulder flexion either at least needs to relax and allow the action to happen, but depending on how far the action of shoulder extension is happening, it perhaps is stretching and lengthening to allow that action to happen. So okay, so anyway, so let's go through the movements of the shoulder girdle and the upper extremity. And so for each of those movements, we'll just review all or most of the muscles that we've talked about that do those actions. Okay, so the first one is elevation of the scapula. So elevation of the scapula, of course, looks like this on one side. You could do it at the same side if you want, but elevation of the scapula. So the muscles that we've talked about that do elevation of the scapula include upper trapezius, so up here, the upper fibers of trapezius, levator scapula, which is deep to trapezius, rhomboids, which are below levator scapula, but they're angled in such a way that they can elevate the scapula, and serratus anterior. So serratus anterior is just going to be the fibers that go to ribs 1, 2, and 3 or so. Those are going to be the ones that can elevate the scapula. Okay, so those muscles elevate the scapula. What muscles depress the scapula? So our next movement that we're looking at is depression of the scapula. So depression of the scapula, we have the lower fibers of trapezius depress the scapula, which means what? That upper fibers of trapezius and lower fibers of trapezius are antagonistic to each other in the action of elevation and depression of the scapula. We didn't talk a lot about latissimus dorsi doing depression of the scapula, but it can. You can think of it as doing it through its attachment to the humerus, that it can pull down there, but many sources will talk about latissimus dorsi attaching to the inferior angle of the scapula. So if elevation of the scapula happens, the fibers of latissimus dorsi need to lengthen to allow that to happen, and if they contract and go back to the position that they're in anatomical position, they'll be pulling the scapula down into depression. Pectoralis minor does depression of the scapula. So remember, pectoralis minor is here from the coracoid process of the scapula to ribs 3, 4, and 5, and it is great at depressing the scapula. And serratus anterior also depresses the scapula. So we also had serratus anterior in that group of muscles that elevate the scapula. So it also is its own antagonist in elevation and depression of the scapula. And so also, let me mention this before I go on. I'm putting on the class website a PDF of a summary of this, so don't feel like you have to go crazy writing this down. You can print that out. It's printed out in column form, so you can, if you print it out, you can fold it in half like this and have the actions on one side and the muscles on the other side, and you can quiz yourself or have somebody quiz you, you know, so somebody can say, okay, elbow flexion, name all the muscles that do elbow flexion, like that kind of thing. Okay, let me also say, while we're pausing between actions here, that that I think it's the next video coming up is a review to prepare for the midterm. So this is not exactly, this is a lot of material that actually is not on the midterm, but this is a good summary of the muscles that we've done so far. Okay, moving on, retraction of the scapula. So that's this action, right? Taking the scapula toward each other behind the back. So retraction or adduction of the scapula. We have trapezius doing that. So the middle fibers of trapezius are going to do adduction of the scapula. Rhomboids are deep to the middle fibers of trapezius and do very similar actions. So they also do retraction of the scapula. And levator scapula, less so. Levator does more elevation, but its fibers are situated in such a way that it does kind of elevation and retraction. And so so it counts, it does retraction of the scapula, or which is also called adduction of the scapula. The opposite action of that is protraction of the scapula, or abduction of the scapula. So protraction of the scapula looks like this, like bringing, so well, we could say if we've done retraction, then protraction can just be returning to anatomical position, or it can be bringing the scapula forward more. So serratus anterior, remember that, prime mover in protraction of the scapula. So often we're talking about, like, you know, a punch or stabilizing that or moving forward from that's where serratus anterior is really working hard. So serratus anterior, prime mover in protraction of the scapula. Pectoralis minor, right here again, protraction of the scapula. Pectoralis major does also do protraction of the scapula. Again, it's a little weird and we didn't talk about it when we talked about pectoralis major because it doesn't attach to the scapula. So as far as we know, it shouldn't be able to move the scapula, right? But it does a strong medial rotation of the shoulder, and that can turn into protraction of the scapula. So pectoralis major can do it, but you're not responsible for knowing that. And okay, and then our last two actions on the scapula are rotations of the scapula. So we have upward rotation of the scapula and downward rotation of the scapula. So we have two muscles doing each of those movements. Upward rotation of the scapula is being done by trapezius and serratus anterior, and then downward rotation of the scapula, so the scapula going from like this down to anatomical position, that's being done by rhomboids and pectoralis minor. Okay, so those are the actions of the scapula. Let's move on to actions of the shoulder. And if you haven't already decided this while watching this video, this is a great opportunity to, you know, when I say the action that we're going to name the muscles for, pause it and see if you can list them all, and then, you know, hit play and see if you've got them. So our next action is shoulder flexion. So what muscles do shoulder flexion? So we have, are we ready? Three major ones and a couple of minor players here. Deltoid, so anterior fibers of deltoid do shoulder flexion. Pectoralis major, the clavicular fibers do shoulder flexion, and biceps brachii here does shoulder flexion. Okay, so those are three of the stronger muscles that do shoulder flexion. And then we also talked about coracobrachialis, that smaller muscle in there that goes from the coracoid process to the kind of the mid shaft of the anterior humerus, and then supraspinatus also. So remember how supraspinatus kind of does this oblique, in this oblique plane, kind of, you know, midway between flexion and abduction, but it's enough that we can call it flexion. So it does some flexion of the shoulder also. So that's shoulder flexion. Let's look at shoulder extension. So what muscles do shoulder extension? Shoulder extension is going to be done by posterior fibers of deltoid. Pectoralis major, so remember pectoralis major does shoulder flexion by the clavicular fibers, and then shoulder extension, the rest of the fibers, or the sternocostal fibers, do shoulder extension. Latissimus dorsi is a very strong muscle that does shoulder extension. It's coming up from the low back and does shoulder extension, and it's muscle that shares most of its actions at the humerus. Teres major, also shoulder extension. Teres minor is a weaker muscle that does shoulder extension, and also our upper arm muscle, our posterior upper arm muscle, triceps brachii, does shoulder extension. So those are our shoulder extension muscles. Let's look at shoulder abduction. This is an easy one. There's one major muscle that does it, and then there's a small helper muscle. So the small helper muscle is supraspinatus, and it initiates shoulder abduction. Deltoid is our big guy that does shoulder abduction. Shoulder adduction is done by more muscles. And why are there more muscles that do shoulder adduction? Because typically it's like if we're pulling ourselves up or pulling, if we're moving the body around by pulling on something, that's what we need those big strong muscles for, to do that shoulder adduction. So it's not so much that it's about moving the arm, although yes, it's about that. Especially like if there's resistance there, but if there's not, if you're holding onto something stable and you're moving your torso to it, that's the same action as shoulder adduction. So what muscles are doing that? Latissimus dorsi, again, big mover in shoulder adduction. Teres major shares all of its actions, so shoulder adduction for teres major. Teres minor also does it, but it's a much smaller player in shoulder adduction. And actually, our little coracobrachialis does it as well, so that's shoulder adduction. Let's see, let's move on to shoulder medial rotation. Okay, so medial rotation of the shoulder. What do we have? We have anterior fibers of deltoid doing medial rotation of the shoulder. We have pectoralis major, so those are two pretty strong muscles that are doing medial rotation of the shoulder. Latissimus dorsi and teres major, so remember these guys are coming from the back through the axillary region to the anterior humerus and then pulling it around toward the back, so they also do a strong medial rotation. And subscapularis is our rotator cuff muscle. It's the one on the anterior side of the scapula that does medial rotation. So those are the muscles that do medial rotation. The ones that do lateral rotation, there are fewer of them, but deltoid, so posterior fibers of deltoid, are going to do lateral rotation. And then we have two rotator cuff muscles that do lateral rotation, and they're infraspinatus and teres minor. Horizontal flexion or horizontal adduction. So that is, a lot of the same muscles that do flexion are going to do that action. So anterior fibers of deltoid do horizontal adduction or horizontal flexion. Pectoralis major does horizontal adduction or horizontal flexion, and then little coracobrachialis also helps out there. Horizontal abduction, mainly there we have the posterior deltoids. We do have the also in the rotator cuff, infraspinatus and teres minor can help out with that, but posterior fibers of deltoid are going to be the main muscle that does shoulder abduction or shoulder extension. Okay, let's move on down the arm. So let's look at elbow flexion. So we're going to look at muscles that move the elbow. So elbow flexion, what muscles do we have? We have biceps brachii, we have brachialis. Those are the two of the upper arm that do elbow flexion. And then remember we also have brachioradialis. That's more of a forearm muscle. That's our handshake muscle. It does elbow flexion. Pronator teres does elbow flexion, not as strong as biceps brachii and brachialis, but it does do it. Supinator does a little bit of elbow flexion, and all of the flexors and extensors of the forearm that cross the elbow and attach at that medial epicondyle of the humerus, they all do weak elbow flexion. Now those muscles, the flexors, did I say flexors and extensors? Just the flexors of the forearm. So remember those flexors of the forearm work more at the wrist, but they cross the elbow and they can participate in some elbow flexion. So, and so it's going to be more the superficial muscles of the forearm that are doing that elbow flexion as far as the flexors go. So flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi ulnaris, palmaris longus, those are the ones that can do some elbow flexion. Elbow extension. So elbow extension looks like this. Big prime mover of elbow extension, triceps brachii. All three of its bellies, all sets of fibers participate in elbow extension. Little helper there for elbow extension is anconeus. And then also other helpers for elbow extension are all of the extensors of the forearm that attach at the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. So those are, again, going to be the more superficial ones. So extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis, extensor carpi ulnaris, extensor digitorum. Those are going to be our extensors that do elbow extension. So again, those are extensors of the forearm that work stronger at the wrist, but they do cross the elbow and extend the elbow as well. Pronation and supination. Let's talk about those actions. So moving down from the elbow to the proximal and distal radial ulnar joints. We're just going to talk about them together movement-wise, because you always move the proximal and distal radial ulnar joints together. So let's start with pronation. This action going from here to here is pronation. So what do we have? We have pronator teres. Of course, any muscle with the name pronator in it is going to do that action. Pronator teres, pronator quadratus. Those both do pronation of the radial ulnar joints, and brachioradialis, our handshake muscle. Remember how brachioradialis takes you from a supination position to this kind of halfway point between pronation and supination. So it does pronation that far. Let's look at supination. So again, brachioradialis takes you from this pronation position to this halfway point between pronation and supination. So it does supination to here. So brachioradialis, and then our kind of our more complete supinators are supinator, we could have guessed that one, and biceps brachii. Those are doing supination. Okay, let's move on to, so moving down the joints, moving on to wrist flexion. So again, wrist flexion, so I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on these because the flexors and extensors and the muscles of the hand, I'm not asking you to know a lot of detail about the actions, but basically I want you to know what you can know from the names of the muscles. So what muscles do wrist flexion? So this is what wrist flexion looks like. Well, that's going to be any muscle on the anterior side of the forearm that crosses onto the hand that has the word flexor in its name, with the exception of palmaris longus that doesn't have the word flexor, but it still does flexion. So we have flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi ulnaris, palmaris longus. We have, let's see, flexor digitorum superficialis, flexor digitorum profundus, and flexor pollicis longus. All of those can flex the wrist. Extension of the wrist, so this action, wrist extension, same thing. It's going to be these muscles of the forearm that originate in the forearm and then attach somewhere in the hand and do wrist extension. So we're going to have extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis, extensor carpi ulnaris, extensor digitorum, extensor indicis, extensor digiti minimi. All of those guys are going to do extension of the wrist. And let's see, what else do we have? Wrist radial deviation and ulnar deviation. Let me get up a little bit so you can see this. So ulnar deviation, radial deviation, right? So deviation of the wrist toward the radial side, deviation of the wrist toward the ulnar side. So those, again, those actions are done by the flexors and extensors. So let me just summarize that by saying the muscles, the flexors and extensors that are on the radial side of the forearm do radial deviation. So for instance, we have flexor carpi radialis, extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis. So those are on the radial side, they all do radial deviation. On the ulnar side, we have flexor carpi ulnaris and extensor carpi ulnaris. They're on the ulnar side, so they do ulnar deviation. So let's see. And then as far as the hand goes, same rule. So a muscle with the word flexor in it, that's if it has the word flexor in it and the word digitorum or the specific name of a digit, it's going to do flexion of the digits. And same with extension. If the muscle has the word extensor in it and either digitorum or the specific name of a digit, like digiti minimi or indicis or pollicis, then it will do extension of those digits. Okay, so that wraps up the movements of the upper extremity. So that's the shoulder girdle, the shoulder, the elbow, the radial ulnar joints, the wrist, and the fingers. so some of the other muscles that we talked about though do have some other actions, some actions on the spine. So let me just complete this by mentioning those two. So we talked about a couple of muscles that do lateral flexion of the cervical spine, and so those are upper fibers of trapezius and levator scapula, do lateral flexion of the spine. Same two muscles do a rotation of the cervical spine, or rotation of the head and neck. In this case, it's going to be upper fibers of trapezius doing a contralateral rotation, and levator scapula, those fibers doing an ipsilateral rotation. And then same two muscles also do extension of the head and neck. So upper fibers of trapezius and levator scapula. To be more specific, trapezius extends the head and neck, and levator just extends the neck because it doesn't attach to the head. But rarely are we isolating just extension of the head, versus extension of the head and neck, but sometimes we do. Okay, so that's it for the summary of the movements of the upper extremity and the shoulder girdle and the muscles that do each of those movements. So I hope that was helpful as a little supplemental review video, and then look for a midterm review video coming up next.